our programs when we can.
Yeah.
And they did not pay us to say that. Okay, it's 1:02. I'm going to go ahead and get started so that we can hopefully end on time. And I see that we've got a good amount of participants and hopefully people will continue to roll in. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Pitt Center for Sustainable Business's first webinar in a series aimed at looking at resilience. That's a word you're going to hear a lot today. Today's topic is energy transitions, building strategic resilience in energy. I'm Madeline Fitzgerald. I'm a program manager at the CSB. We've got the rest of the CSB staff on the call here as well. Okay, great, we are recording. To give everyone a quick lay of the land for what we're going to do here today, I'm going to give a brief introduction before I hand it off to our distinguished speakers for the bulk of the hour, with time for questions and some interaction in the second half of the hour. Today, we're very honored to have our speakers with us here today, and you can see them on video. We have Dr. Kris Ramanadhan, a former executive from ExxonMobil, Albrecht Powell, managing director at Accenture, and the University of Pittsburgh's own Professor Ravi Madhavan. I'm going to allow them to speak more in depth about their own introductions, their backgrounds, and we'll also note that within Zoom, you'll be able to access their bios at any time during the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and then will be shared online for those who aren't able to attend or for those who want to have repeat viewings. The Q&A function is turned on for you to type all of your questions throughout, and you'll also be able to upvote questions as they come in that you see that you really would like to see answered in that back half of the hour. And we'll try to flag questions that are relevant to the topic that's being discussed in that moment to Ravi to then incorporate into the discussion as well. We're also going to be keeping the chat open for everyone to introduce themselves if they feel comfortable, so that you can see who else is in attendance here today. We love to see people connecting and networking, and we encourage you to do that in a way that's respectful of the speakers and what's being discussed at that time, as well as the other participants. Before I hand it off to Ravi, I am going to talk quickly about the Center for Sustainable Business. So I'm gonna flip slides real quick. I'm gonna ask one of my CSB fellow staff to take a quick maybe screenshot of this Slido so that we can come back to it if we see any real trends emerging to talk about. But I'll talk about the Center for Sustainable Business, which is housed within the University of Pittsburgh here. All right, I got a thumbs up that a screenshot was taken, so I'll go ahead and advance slides here. So the CSB, our purpose is to partner with companies to innovate and implement resilient, responsible, and profitable business strategies that overcome societal, technological, environmental, and economic disruptions. Like I said, resilience, the word you're going to keep hearing today, it's really at the core of everything that we do. We achieve our purpose through 4 key programs. The first is our Resilient Organizational Architecture Diagnostic Tool, our ROAD tool, which is a free assessment that anyone can take to help self-assess where your organization needs strategic interventions. Then we have our RESET program, which stands for Resilient Strategies Executive Training, an immersion workshop for leading through disruptions to drive profits. And that's a program that individuals can attend on behalf of themselves, on behalf of their companies, or we can also host company-specific versions of that event for multiple employees, all from one company. We have our Resilience Lab strategy projects where we bring faculty-led, student-powered teams together with organizations to co-create viable business models. The University of Pittsburgh has some of the best faculty in the world, so we're very lucky to have them leading research with us on these projects. And I'm not just saying that because we have Ravi on the call here. And then lastly, our convenings. We bring together leaders to learn from their peers on a variety of resilience topics. That includes webinars like these, and then our twice annual Sustainable Business Forum. And we're, of course, always looking for more friends, more collaborators, so please reach out to us if you're interested in any of the programs or just want to chat with us about anything resilience, sustainability, anything like that. All right, with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Ravi, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Madeline. This is great. It's really a nice opportunity for us to bring together some of these ideas relating not only to energy but to resilience. And it's my privilege to be the moderator, to be your moderator here in this session. And of course, I have two very distinguished panelists, Kris Ramanadhan and Albrecht Powell, both of whom bring a wealth of experience and insight to this issue. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Just to also indicate one other aspect that makes me excited about this is that although my day job is really as a professor of strategy, I'm keenly interested in the energy system, energy technologies in particular. And I came to it because of my interest in what I describe as complex capabilities. I'm very interested in some of these really challenging systems and tasks and what it takes for companies and enterprises to master those and to manage those well. And as a result of that, one of the areas in which I've been doing some field work over the last 15 or so years is the nuclear energy industry, especially as countries like China come up to speed in that area. So I was especially pleased in Madeline's Slido word cloud to see a few topics relating to nuclear energy. So perhaps that's something that we can get back to in a little while. For now, though, what I'd like to do is to take a moment to share with you just a little bit of a broad way of thinking about what we are doing here. Okay, this is just to gently set the context, and I'd like to begin by asking the question: why should business leaders and strategists pay attention to energy transition today? Okay, now clearly that's a topic that we can spend a lot of time on, but what I'll do is to limit myself to some aspects that are represented in these two charts. Okay, starting with the left-hand chart, right? What that graph is showing is a very simple and straightforward relationship between energy use and GDP per capita, right? Bottom line, the richer the world becomes, the higher the energy use, right? The higher the energy intensity. And if there's any doubt at all about why that is the case, all we have to do is to reflect on the fact that a single generative AI query today consumes 10 times the energy of a Google search. Right? So we can just imagine as the world becomes more and more sophisticated in that respect, there's greater energy intensity. The second chart is, I would say, a little bit more even more interesting. And what it does is to show us the really long-term history of how energy use has changed throughout the US history. Okay, and I'll call out three insights from this chart. Right, one is that it takes a long time for big changes to happen in the energy sector. Right, for example, it was around 1885 that coal surpassed wood to become the dominant source of energy, and that situation remained for maybe about 75, 80 years. Right. So it's a relatively slow-moving system because it's operating at such scale and is so complex. And at the same time, change is a constant factor in this. Number two, if you look at this chart, it becomes quite clear that when we talk about energy transition, it's not a simple linear energy transition where one major source of energy is completely eliminated and supplanted by a new source of energy. Rather, what we see is a portfolio, right? And the mix changes over time very slowly, but the portfolio as a whole is growing, which actually leads to some interesting ideas proposed by historians of energy like Jean-Baptiste Fressow, who say that energy transitions are not linear, rather they tend to be symbiotic expansions, right? Again, very interesting notion, which takes us into the idea that this is an overall portfolio which is becoming multi-source over time, rather than successively eliminating some sources. And third, and most important, as an insight from this chart, is if you look at this right-hand side here, right, roughly representing where we are today, what you see is petroleum is still dominant, right? Natural gas has been ascendant for a while. It's almost caught up. And down here, you see renewables, coal, and nuclear, all of them at roughly 8 to 9%, and sort of battling it out, so to speak, right? And that those three features that I called out from the chart actually translates very well to the idea of resilience, right? As Madeline indicated, resilience is a focus of the work that we are doing at the Center for Sustainable Business. And resilience in our minds is more than surviving, more than surviving disruptions, right? It's also about emerging stronger, right? And related to that is the idea that we are all familiar with now, right? That the term VUCA world is familiar to many of you in strategy and related fields: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. But that world is also, in the words of Jaime Castillo, the futurist, is also a brittle world, right? Where things are prone to breaking. And we know that is true with energy systems. It's an anxious world for individuals, companies, government, etc. It's non-linear in terms of the way that things scale, good things as well as bad things. And all of it combine to make it a rather difficult world to comprehend. So in that world, we believe at CSB that resilience is a critical organizational capability, a key strategic factor. And the diagnostic that Madeline referred to is a framework that we have put together based on a lot of prior literature as well as our ongoing research that will help companies to think it through. Now, clearly, that resilience is top of mind when we look at energy disruptions here, right? And so coming to this last bit here, in today's discussion, what we are going to do is to undertake an examination of what I would describe as a business perspective, right? Not so much the political or the geo-economic types of questions that come up, but a business perspective of how the shift that is currently underway in the global energy system impacts enterprises, right? Companies, government enterprises, communities, and so on. So enterprise strategies would be one pasture of discussion. Another pasture of discussion would be innovation in technologies, in business models, etc. And finally, I would say the impact of policy, right? Government policy has a crucial impact, right? Even when we are talking about the world of business, there are lots of non-market strategy aspects that come in. And so that is really what comprises our third area or domain of discussion. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I couldn't think of a better pair of panelists here for us to learn something about all of these things. And so what we'll do in the next few minutes is I've asked each of these panelists, beginning with Albrecht and then followed by Kris, to take, I would say, 6 to 7 minutes just to share with us how they think broadly about these types of issues, right? So beginning with you, Albrecht, take us into your mindset. We asked the audience the question, what comes to mind when they hear the term energy transition? What comes to your mind when you hear the term energy transition? And how do you think about it?
Thanks, Ravi. I appreciate it. And I'm so excited to be part of the panel here today with you and Kris. Just a quick introduction of myself. So Albrecht Powell, Managing Director at Accenture. I focus a lot on large-scale technology transformation. I lead our data and AI practice. I run our Pittsburgh office. But I've spent most of my 35 years in the energy and manufacturing industries. So I spend a lot of time focused on this space. I also help drive our sustainability business within Accenture. And I'm very active in the local region, especially with our amazing partnership with the Pitt Center for Sustainable Business. So I'm excited about this topic. I think this has huge impact across, frankly, all businesses and industries. This is real. This is happening. And companies that embrace this concept and are innovative, I think they have an opportunity to really springboard. Like, this is truly a once in a century transformation of our entire global energy system. And the pressures are enormous. I think it's a huge opportunity for innovation and growth. So I wanted to set the stage today with 4 key concepts. So the first one is, what I'm seeing across industries, from everything from heavy manufacturing to tech and retail, this is a mindset shift. This is not about if this is going to happen. That's been answered. It is. The more urgent question is, how fast can we move? How fast can we do it in a way that really strengthens our business and has, frankly, a financial impact? And even though there's a ton of headwinds out there, companies are focusing on 3 big value drivers when we think about energy transition. So the first one is when we look at the environmental impact. So this isn't just about reducing carbon, right? It's about improving air quality. It's about improving water use. It's about improving biodiversity. And for a lot of companies, it's become frankly, a competitive advantage in both their brand and their investor perceptions. Apple, as an example, they've cut their footprint nearly its half from its peak. And they're using that influence to bring a lot of suppliers along with it. And that's one of their brand images. And that's leadership in the space. So environmental impact is the first. The second, and we'll talk about these more as we get through the Q&A later on, but the second is diversification. So what do I mean by that? Firms are starting to look at diversifying their energy sources. Whether it's solar, wind, hydrogen, biofuels, they're reducing that dependence on the traditional fossil fuels or single supply chains. And this is important because, we've seen an increase in natural disasters and other events that have impacted our power grids. We've seen that here in, the Pittsburgh and tri-state region recently, more than we have in my lifetime here. And having a diversified energy source, such as renewables, this can help mitigate these disruptions and give companies a competitive edge. So, companies like Walmart, they're investing heavily in renewable energy, not just to meet their ESG targets, but to avoid price volatility and increase reliability if things happen. The third area, so environmental impact diversification, is cost reduction. Look, at the end of the day, we can talk about global warming, we can talk about the environment, we can talk about carbon. Those are all critically important, especially for our next generations. But at the end of the day, Wall Street drives a lot of what we do. So cost reduction. Look, a decade ago, clean energy was incredibly expensive, but that's changed. The cost of solar, wind, batteries, it's dropped 70 to 90% in the last 10 years. Companies like 3M, they've saved over $2.5 billion through efficiency upgrades, showing that making this kind of move can be profitable, especially if you're looking long-term. So that brings us to the headwinds, right? This is not easy. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it and taking advantage. But the reality is companies are navigating these headwinds, right? We've got inconsistent regulations across, even in the US and in other countries. Policy, what's happening in Washington right now, things are changing rapidly, even in the last few months. So, what policy do we follow, right? Uneven incentives. We had incentives for electric cars. They may be going away. How do we deal with that? And then, rapid technology and disruptive technology advances. Ravi talked a little bit about AI. This is huge because we can use AI to help optimize energy production, use it to help optimize usage, but its use is skyrocketing, and the energy needed to run it and to run the data centers is also skyrocketing. We'll talk about that more a little later, but with that coupled with this goal of increasing manufacturing in the US, this whole power transformation is going to become much more top of mind. The last area here is high startup costs, right? It doesn't help when our companies are all focused on the next quarter. The challenge is How do you transform? How do you think long term? How do you make these investments? And time after time after time, companies that are investing in this, they over time, it may take 2 or 3 years, the ROI is staggering. And the impact on their ability to be, more resilient, to be more diverse in their energy sources, the image and brand that they have, and then help in the environment is huge. So what are these companies that are taking advantage of this doing differently, right? They're embedding energy transition in their corporate strategy, not as a side initiative, but a core focus. They're investing in workforce transformation. Look, if we're going to do this, we need an entirely new suite of people. We need more electricians, systems engineers. We need AI analysts. We need carbon accountants. The whole workforce transformation is huge. And they're positioning their company within ecosystems, right? Partnering with startups, with governments, even other competitors to scale solutions much faster. And, there's a ripe here opportunity for startups to go create all these new next-gen modular nuclear, next-gen battery, carbon to product technologies. It's a huge growth opportunities. So it's an exciting topic. Companies that get it, they're going to attract the best talent. They're going to secure capital. They're going to build resilient, future-proof operations. Ultimately, they're going to save money. So this is transformative beyond belief. So I'm going to pause there. You'll hear more from me in a few minutes. Kris, I wanted to jump over to you and give you a chance because I know you've got some good insights on this as well.
Okay, thank you, Albrecht. Yeah, my name is Kris Ramanadhan. I worked for ExxonMobil for 40 years, believe it or not, same company. I had a lot of experience in manufacturing, in refining and petrochemicals, and subsequently in corporate planning, strategic planning. Spent a number of years in China, got a good sense of how the Chinese system works and some of the challenges that they've handled. I was involved in negotiating some commercial ventures out there in China, and then also handled a number of capital projects, excuse me, capital projects for ExxonMobil. After retirement, I became an independent consultant. And one of the areas that I particularly am interested in is the entire oil and gas value chain and helping train managers and executives in that area. And so one of the areas of focus in the last few years has been energy transition, all the challenges and the opportunities that I think Albrecht and Ravi talked about. When I think of energy transition, I think of it like a three-legged stool. One leg is actually making sure that as an industry, we can supply the energy responsibly to the public as they need it. The second is the environment, meeting the environmental guidelines, whether it's a carbon target or some sort of a decarbonization goal, making sure we can meet that. But the third one is very important, and that is making sure there's economics behind it, because as a listed company, as a private company, you got to have some economic basis to make that happen. And what I wanted to share with you, since Albrecht and Ravi have talked about the kind of the fundamentals, I want to share with you a couple of observations about countries that have made fairly successful transitions in the energy space. I'll start with Norway. Norway is a relatively small country, but Norway was historically always based on oil and gas. And that's really the primary revenues stream for them. But over the last few decades, they made a conscious choice. They said, we want to be resilient. We want to decouple from price excursions and volatility on the fossil fuel prices. So they made a conscious decision to leverage on renewable energy. And in their case, it's mostly hydro. So they developed that technology, they ramped it up, and then they supplemented with solar and wind power as well as a little bit of nuclear. But the important thing is, I looked at their energy focus right now is while they continue to export oil and gas outside Norway, internally within Norway, they're almost 95% using renewable energy for power generation. That's one example. The other example I wanted to talk about is China. China is a big country, and China has been burning coal for a number of years. And China has taken strides to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by switching from coal to renewables. And they've done an amazing job in the last, 15, 20 years. And in fact, they were partly responsible for the significant reduction in solar panel cost and renewable energy costs that you've seen. And what they did was the government was behind it, provided a lot of incentives, but more fundamentally, they streamlined the permitting process it was not that difficult to get transmission lines put in, because this is a major problem in many countries, is the distribution system on power generation. They went ahead and did that, and last year I believe they spent close to $1 trillion. And to put that in perspective, they generated about 350 gigawatts of power. So they're number one in the world. Number two in the world is the US, by the way, but the US was at the 50 gigawatts. So you can see the difference of contrast between China and the US. And the reason I bring China is because one of the objectives that China had was resilience on the energy system, and that is energy security, right? Because China does not have a lot of gas, so a lot of gas is imported as LNG. And what they decided strategically was, we want to be independent, we want to develop our own resources, we want to be reliant on renewables. The renewables happens to be way away from the demand centers, like 1,500 miles or so. So they put in transmission lines at extremely high voltage, like 1,000,000 volts, high voltage transmission called ultra high voltage transmission. And they did that and they've been successful. It's so successful that more than 50 to 60% of the power generation last year in China was actually from renewable energy. And I bring that up only to say that what the Chinese have done is kind of leveraged on the resource that they had, the solar and wind, as well as some hydro, but more importantly, provided a framework, a cooperative framework between the public sector and the private sector that enabled the private sector to participate. And the public sector was the one that was instrumental in terms of providing grants and incentives to get this thing going. So that's another example. Canada is another example. In Canada, I think something like 75 to 80% of power is based on renewables. Now they have a lot of hydro power, but once again, the government provided the incentives, worked with the private sector, and the public-private partnership is really what helped to make the transition. And the reason I bring that up is when I look at these countries, I see some common threads, for success. What do I see? One is the public sector has taken an active role in setting policy. Number two, the policy is a sustained policy over decades, as opposed to a policy for 4 or 5 years that can change, because that gives a certain amount of certainty for the investing community. And then the third thing is there's a lot of cooperation from the public to make these things happen. So when those 3 or 4 parameters come into the picture, then what you see is energy transition taking place, decarbonization is taking place, the energy demands are still being met, resilience is established because you're sort of decoupled from the price volatility of oil and gas and shifted more to renewables. And I would say that one of the most important, observations that I made was the stability of public policy. The importance of policy, where investors can look at the policy and say, this is the policy the government is gonna implement. Now there are different types of policies. Okay, for example, on carbon removal, the European Union has got a very different policy than the U.S. The European Union has got what's called a cap and trade policy, which basically says that if you're an emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, there's a cost associated with that. They establish a cap. And if you're below the cap, then you can trade those credits. If you're above the cap, you have to pay for it. But that cap declines over time. All right. That's the model there. The US is very different. It's more an incentive-based model. In the US, you get credits, tax credits for removing carbon dioxide, for example, and that has triggered a whole bunch of investment. So different ways of implementing the policy, but the important thing that I found was stability in policy, a cooperation between the public and private sector. And the other thing that I found was the public sector has got a role in terms of policy making and supporting R&D and providing some grants and just get this thing going. The private sector is the one that gets innovation and technology going. And the eventual model that has happened in some countries like Chile, for example, they have been able to move away from the public sector support to purely private. But that transition process takes time. It's not easy, but you got to have a stable policy mindset to do that. And I'm sure we'll talk some more in the Q&A session about specific examples. But decarbonization is a very important aspect. And there are 2 ways of looking at decarbonization. You can either reduce the carbon coming in to the system, or you can take out carbon on the back end through CO2 removal. And we'll talk about some of the details as we get into the Q&As. Ravi?
Thank you. Thank you, Kris. And thank you, Albrecht. But both of you have laid out a whole range of very interesting topics for us to dig a little bit further into. And meanwhile, I see that there are lots of questions coming in from the audience as well. So from my own perspective, as I was listening to both of you lay out, the state of energy transition as you see them, I was struck by a couple of things. One, with your comments, Albrecht, I was struck by, first of all, the idea that you mentioned of companies in the process of dealing with the challenges of energy transition are actually figuring out ways to turn it into a competitive advantage, right? I think that's a very interesting reframe of the problem, if you will. And in a very interesting way, it sort of picks up on one of the big things from the word cloud, right? Where I think apparently many people said opportunity, right, rather than a problem, right? So that was an interesting aspect. The other thing that you mentioned when you talked about the workforce impact, right? I wrote down, you mentioned electricians as well as AI engineers, right? So this is, the job impact in a positive way is really that we really need people at different levels of education, for example, right? Or specialization, more accurately. So I think those are very interesting things. Again, you talked about cost reduction, but this idea that perhaps, and one way to think about all of this is to translate it into efficiency and cost, and that itself will drive a lot of adaptation on the part of corporations. So that I found very interesting. Again, Kris, you took a very complementary approach, in your remarks when you talked about the country level illustrations, right? And how different countries have done different things to make progress in this arena. Norway, China, and so on. But again, the two or three things that you mentioned, which are very much worth digging deeper into, is first of all, I would say the importance of policy stability, right? In fact, it almost seemed to me that what you were saying is, regardless of what the policy is, the stability is a more important consideration, right? Because that sort of that provides opportunities for investments, right? In a way that is, and the policy stability gives some comprehensibility to the decision makers when it comes to making the right kinds of investments. You talked about the complementarity between the private sector and the public sector. In fact, again, one of the future webinars that the center is planning is on public-private partnerships. So I think that's certainly something that is relevant there. And of course, you talked about the importance of decarbonization, and in particular, we may, if we have time, we can go into some of the technologies that are now available, right? Not only to remove oxygen from current and future production, carbon dioxide, I'm sorry, from future production, but even to extract and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? So that's really, I think, very intriguing set of technologies. So we'll talk about some of those things. So as we do that, Albrecht, let me turn to you. One of the topics that you mentioned was, the ideas you mentioned was that this is not an easy transition, right? So when you think about your clients, right, the companies that you advise in these, what are the biggest sources of friction for them, right? The biggest barriers in terms of the changing and adapting.
Ravi,
in spite of the energy transition.
Yeah, the biggest that we see, to be honest, is the balance between Wall Street and Wall Street. And what I mean by that is there is such a deep pressure on, quarterly profits. What are you doing in the next quarter? And, if I look back 10, even 10 years ago, a lot of companies would come out and say, we're in this for the long term. We're making investments right now. We have a dip this quarter, this year, because we're investing and we're looking for growth 2-3 years out. Wall Street's having a hard time with that these days, right? It's all about maximizing the current. So, you know, when I look at organizations, they're struggling with that because they see it. They see the ROI 2 or 3 years down the road. They understand the environmental benefits. They understand the cost reduction benefits. Resiliency and diversification of energy sources. I see one of the pings in the chat, which we'll get to in a minute, on even here in Pittsburgh, the 9/11th and 171st, the Reserve and Guard base out at the Pittsburgh airport. You know, they've gone without power because they're on the grid, right? And the Pitt airport has a massive solar grid and renewable energy grid, but they can't share them, right? So companies are starting to put this on the board agenda, on the C-suite agenda, and they're starting to realize that, hey, you know what? Let's make these investments. You know, a real fun, simple example. I was out at Pitt, Ohio, about 3 weeks ago. This is a big transportation logistics company headquartered here in Pittsburgh. They do trucking, they do supply chain management, and you know, pretty big size company. They made a decision about a decade ago that sustainability would power future generations. That's kind of their tagline. And they made a non-trivial investment. But when you go out to their facilities, right, you look at everything from, they've got, you know, here in Pittsburgh, 1,500 solar panels on the roof. Right? They've got 8 60-foot wind stack wind turbines. The combination of those produces enough energy to almost fully manage their facility, right? So they've lost their reliance on the power grid. They got banks of batteries to store that. So they can run whenever the power grid's down. You know, they put in low flow fixtures and waterless urinals. It was funny because they were up talking about, you know, okay, we have, you know, 150 truck drivers a day, and they go to the bathroom twice a day, and every time you flush, it's X gallons of water. And you do the simple math, and it's like, wow, that actually saves a lot. All LED lighting, geothermal heating and cooling, recycled content in all their seating and tables and chairs, electric forklifts. The facility is pristine. There's no natural gas smell. There's no you know, smoke from combustion engines. And the people that work there love working there. They're able to retain their workforce. They're able to attract their workforce. They're able to partner with people because they are well known as being so green. And most of all, they've reduced costs dramatically. I don't want to share how much, but it has been a dramatic cost reduction. It was an investment up front. Now they're riding that wave forward. So, you know, the companies that we talk to, it's a bit of a sell. But it's funny, it's going in and looking in your own home and counting the light bulbs and counting the, you know, cost of a 60-watt bulb versus a 1-watt bulb and doing the math. And it's like, it's real. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think we need to focus on, is getting companies to think about that ROI as much as they do about the environmental aspects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a fascinating example. Pitt, Ohio, is a big supporter of one of our fellow centers here, the Center for the Supply Chains, right? And it's really good to see, to hear about that example. Thank you, Albrecht. Kris, you know, I'm going to depart a little bit from some of the questions that we had earlier talked about, because there's a very interesting question that one of the audience members posted, which is, I think, it fits right in with your concern about stakeholder relations, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and the policy impact, some of the non-market considerations in energy. And this is about the fact that very often, regrettably, there's almost an adversarial relationship between
Yep.
large corporations and communities.
Yep.
You know, for example, a large corporation moves into a rural area, promising construction jobs, but then, you know, gobbles up a lot of the precious water and energy supplies, driving up costs for everyone. What are some best practices for sort of making these incentives somewhat a little bit more symmetric, right? That is, there's greater incentive for corporations to collaborate with communities and vice versa?
Yeah, so energy companies have been doing this for years, right? I mean, we've been doing this for years because whenever we go and build a new plant or explore some resources, invariably you disrupt the infrastructure there, right? You disrupt it.
Right.
And so, typically there's an environmental impact assessment, right, that we have to go through. And I think the key is to be upfront with the local public, to be very upfront and engage with them early on. And then engage with them early on to the point of saying that, look, here's the trade-offs we have, right? There's economic growth, there's going to be more jobs created, there's more opportunities. But in the early process of project development and construction, there's going to be disruption. But the corporation has got to come up with a setup so that eventually, once the facilities are installed, the system is able to meet the needs of the people. And to me, what I've found is always it's the disruption part, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5 years, it's the disruption part. Sometimes you have to relocate people too, right? That's another disruption. And so that has got to be managed, but we got to be pretty honest with the people as to what's going on. And invariably getting involved and engaged with the local community, the leadership of the locals is critical. And as you said, this is a major constraint. Like even in the utilities arena, for example, we get a lot of sun and wind and we get all this power, we have batteries, but you got to transmit them to the demand centers. And transmission lines are expensive, difficult to install. And one of the biggest bottlenecks that we see in the US, for example, is just the ability to build transmission lines, is to get the permits, just to get approval from everybody on right of ways. And so this is a real problem. So this is where I mentioned some of the models, the country models, where the country somehow was able, now in the case of China, it probably was by edict, but it was able to cooperate with the public and say, this is the right long-term answer. And we're going to have a cost-effective structure. It's going to give us a resilient set of infrastructure. And that engagement process is hard, but can be done. And that's the way to do it, is to get the early engagement process.
No, no, the early engagement certainly makes a lot of sense to me. It seems that you're also saying that, that aspect of stakeholder relations is not an overlay on the technical and economic aspects of the project. It has to be part of the design.
Absolutely.
Altogether, right? It's not an afterthought.
Absolutely.
It has to be part
No,
of
no. And in all big capital projects, especially intensive capital projects on energy, the stakeholder alignment is critical. It's done up front. The environmental impact assessment is significant. You got to get participants involved and they have to buy into what you're saying. Now, there's always going to be people who don't like it, but at the end of the day, you got to get a consensus. And so stakeholder alignment is critical. And when you look at a country and you look at the energy transition process, you have so much infrastructure that you got to build on energy transition. You're crossing municipalities, cities, and towns and states, and all of them have to come together. And so working on that early on is actually a very critical element of the transition process, because that's the harder stuff. The technology sometimes is the easier stuff. The more difficult thing is to get the people aligned in terms of objectives. And the question everybody's asking is, what is in there for me? Right? And that's the question. So that's the reason I said there's got to be some sort of a business case in all these transitions. Something that says, I've got to get a return on investment. I'm going to create jobs. I'm going to improve the technology. I'm going to increase the skill sets. There's more training involved. All of that is a very basic component of these projects.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's really a very interesting set of issues there. Now we have more audience questions, and I'll turn to those in a moment. But one area that I wanted to ask both of you about was where are the innovations coming from with regard to the energy transition, both in terms of technologies and business models, right? So for instance, again, both of you have years of experience and insight into this industry. What's on your radar when it comes to things that are really either already beginning to change or will fundamentally change the way we think about energy transition in the next decade or so?
So maybe I'll give you a couple of comments here. The utility system, the whole solar, hydro, wind energy, the costs have come down dramatically, right, over the last 5, 10 years. And that's the reason there's more penetration, which means there's a business case now to do it. It's not just you're doing it for the environmental reasons. It's really, it makes sense to do it. Like it actually is cheaper in China, for example, to build power plants with solar and wind rather than a gas turbine. It's just pure economics. Now, so there's a tremendous amount of work going on in terms of the solar technology, and it has increased the intensity of solar collection. It has increased the efficiency. The costs have gone down. The scales have gone up. You got solar arrays. You have heat pump technology that has come in, rooftop solar technology. So there's a whole lot going on. And the other one is, I think, what Albrecht was talking about, which is the AI, right? The application of AI in the utility arena significantly improved the ability to monitor demand and make the supply-demand balances much tighter than before, almost to the point where the AI is telling you exactly something is going to go fail and we better go and fix it before it fails, right? So digital twinning technology is one where you model the entire system using a digital tool, and it's a predictive model, helps on maintenance, helps on capacity utilization, helps you on design too. So you put less investment than before. So that's one thing. Now, I will tell you on the hydrocarbon side, there's a lot of work going on. ExxonMobil is a great example, right, of technology where ExxonMobil has got a lot of experience in the subsurface exploration, capital investments. And so they have a lithium project. You normally wouldn't think of that, but there's a lithium project in Arkansas that ExxonMobil is pursuing, which is extracting lithium from brine water. And it's an extraction process that ExxonMobil has got a lot of expertise in. And that lithium is going to be extracted and then sold to the battery manufacturers, right? And so lithium being a major component of battery, that's where you see the synergy. So the technology development is there. The other area there's a lot of work going on is hydrogen, right? Hydrogen is a clean fuel. But the problem with hydrogen is, making hydrogen is expensive, right? Making hydrogen is expensive. Now, Chevron, for example, is participating in a hydrogen plant in Utah, which is called green hydrogen because it is based on renewable energy. So renewable energy, electrolysis of water makes hydrogen. The hydrogen is stored in a cavern, and the hydrogen can then be used for power plants as a fuel, either directly or as a blend with natural gas. So whole host of technologies are going on in the decarbonization arena. There's technology going on in recycling of plastics, for example. So this is one thing that is going on. And I think the technological breakthroughs are going to help reduce the cost. But the real challenge is until that happens, how do you keep going? And that's where you need financial support, either through the investment community or through grants or tax incentives or whatever. And this is where I was getting back to the long-term stability of policymaking, because that is what helps you to kind of get off the initial, challenging area where you are able to develop scale-up technologies, reduce the cost, make it commercial, and then the private sector can take over from there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kris. That's a whole panoply of technologies and innovations that could be exciting to track as we go forward. Albrecht, same question to you with regard to technologies. And I know from previous conversations that you are particularly excited by AI. And in fact, we have several questions from the audience on implications of AI for the energy space. So what are some thoughts you might want to share on that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that AI is doing, and just industrial digitization is kind of what it's called, is bringing technology for the entire energy supply chain. So putting Internet of Things, advanced sensors, at all points of the supply chain, so you have better real-time knowledge of what's happening from extraction to production to transmission to use. And if we can track each area along there, we can determine where there's loss, where there's optimization, and monitor that consumption and better than optimize it. A great example is smart grids and smart cities. There's a number of areas, especially out west, where they've basically built cities on what they call a smart grid, and each house has a meter, right? And what the cost of your energy is, today at 2 o'clock Eastern versus at 2 in the morning. And a lot of your appliances, like you set your washer or your dryer to run at 2 or 3 in the morning, and you save a few bucks on energy. More importantly, the grid isn't spiked when it's particularly hot out there. We're also looking, so there's a whole suite of ways that we're using technology, AI, and reporting there. A couple other on the physical side. I mean, Kris mentioned, carbon capture. In the Permian Basin of Texas, they're now have a process where they take captured CO2, right, which is good, and injecting it into oil fields to enhance oil recovery. So they're using the problem to help optimize oil extraction. It's a company, Mission Zero Technologies in the UK. They have a facility that takes carbon from the air and converts it into building materials, right, and to manufacture the limestone. And they're able to do this cost effective and efficiently. So, it's win-win, but it takes innovation to do that. We've got, production, micronuclear reactors now, much smaller footprint, much safer, that can be put in local areas, which again reduces the need for these large facilities, brings energy closer to the consumer. Fusion, used to be, decades and decades away. We're seeing huge breakthroughs there. So, huge opportunities across the board, especially for startups to come in to help drive this kind of innovation.
And Ravi, Ravi, if I may add a comment onto that. The other thing that's happening with the energy transition is there are new business models that are coming through, right? In other words, new partnerships are being developed that you wouldn't think of some time back. Again, I'll go back to ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil, for example, is building the world's largest hydrogen plant, the blue hydrogen plant, right, in Texas. And the objective is to use the hydrogen for ammonia, right? And then the ammonia is then is offtake by Japan, and Japan can use it in power, right? So you see some new business models that are coming in. And the other thing is Exxon is also the global leader in carbon capture and storage. And so they purchased a 1,400-mile pipeline in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And what they do is they offer as a service the extraction of CO2 from other industries. It could be like a Nucor Steel, it could be a Linde, for example, or CF Industries that are producing CO2. They recover the CO2, put it into the pipeline, take it through the pipeline, and then use it for enhanced oil recovery, like Albert was talking about, or put it underground, sequester it. So that whole thing becomes a business model, and it's got its own business case, right? That's what you want to end up with. So you're helping other parties decarbonize. At the same time, there's an incentive to do that, and that would be reflected on your P&L.
No, and it's an important point that you bring up there, that the innovation is not only in technologies,
No,
right, but they have to be complemented by innovations in those business models. Thank you. Now again, I have no way of getting through the fascinating range of questions that our audience members have posed. Because we just have another 5 minutes, so let me just pick two of them, and I'm going to ask each of you to address a question very briefly. So with you, staying with you, Kris, for the moment, there's a question about the fossil majors, right? In what way are those fossil majors, like ExxonMobil, holding themselves accountable in ways that make business sense, right? Because that's really the challenge, right? That boards are facing, that top managers are facing. Again, going back to our earlier discussion about there's the business imperative, there is also the community imperative, right, the stakeholder demands, etc. So again, what are some things that they are doing? Is it again new things, for example?
Yeah. So and you can look at it from the sustainability report. I mean, ExxonMobil has got some very clear guidelines in terms of decarbonization, some clear targets, and so they are following the target. And the approach that they're taking is really focused primarily on decarbonization through carbon capture. Okay, so playing a major role in that, right? So it is not only decarbonizing their own facilities, but also helping others decarbonize. So that's a major initiative. The other initiative is ammonia, as I mentioned, hydrogen, as I mentioned. They're getting into some aviation fuel, the sustainable aviation fuel, but that's the area of focus. Now, I will contrast that with Chevron, that is probably more focused on hydrogen, as I mentioned, geothermal, some more nuclear. BP is looking at, what they call e-mobility, which is looking at changing their retail outlets to electric power outlets. So they kind of took a slightly different role. Shell has done the same thing. The one comment I would have, though, is on these, if you go too fast, okay, then you get pushback from the investors because they feel like you're not getting a return on investment. And so there's always this continuing focus on the base case, which is oil and gas. I mean, that's the bread and butter. So you need to make that transition in a well thought out way where you get a return on these incremental investments and you're gradually making that transition as opposed to making a drastic transition simply because you want to get there.
No, that certainly makes sense because again, the sustainability even of the organization, right? So that you can continue to do those investments in the emerging areas. Thank you. And Albrecht, so just to wrap up, earlier you came up with a very interesting Wall Street versus Wall Street framing. We have an audience member who asks, what does Wall Street need to do on its own? And what do we need to do as customers or people who are dependent on Wall Street in order to push this along?
Yeah, well, look, shareholders notice, right? I posted one of the answers. There's $2.8 trillion that are in managed funds right now that are ESG focused funds. So these are people that are purposefully investing in companies that they feel are, whatever you want to call it, good, whether they're green or looking after the environment or sustainable or resilient or whatever the term is. So I personally believe this is a positive thing. I think we need to do more to showcase the benefits and not just focus on the environment or the green, because some people look at this and it's like, oh, climate change, or oh, you're tree huggers. Again, our generation, I don't care. I'm going to be dead before there's any impact. My kids will probably be dead, but their kids, they're going to be impacted. I mean, we have a finite amount of coal in the ground. If I don't know, climate change, we're seeing changes here in Western Pennsylvania, right? We're seeing, there were 22 tornado warnings in my town this year, and there were 4 in the last 10 years, right? Something is changing out there. So while I think that is all incredibly important, and we do need to look after the environment and we need to look at future generations, I think the more we can focus on the business benefits, a company that when the power grid goes down, they've got renewable energy sources they can rely on to continue operating. That's a competitive advantage. Or in the case of the person that posted on the National Guard base out at the airport, that's a national security advantage, right? So, I think people like us, people on this call, need to keep espousing the return on investment, the business benefits, the practical benefits, because I think, when companies see that, it causes them pause. Companies like Pitt, Ohio, they make these investments, they're reaping huge benefits. I know our firm, we're pretty well known for this, and we attract talent because people are like, I want to work for a company that does good. So I think there's huge benefit out there, but we all have to continue to sort of beat the drum and get that message out there.
Thank you. Thank you both, Kris and Albrecht. Now, it's quite clear at the end of an hour that we have only just begun this conversation, right? I guess that's one of the challenges of picking such an important and timely topic, right? We could easily spend many more hours on this. So thank you to the audience, for teeing up all of these really intriguing questions. We only got to a very small number. So stay tuned, keep in touch with us. This is clearly an area of interest to the center, and we hope to have similar opportunities. Thank you to the team at CSB, and thank you most of all to the panelists. You have not only shared your experience, but you have thrown into the mix a number of interesting ideas and reframing thoughts that I think will be extremely valuable. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.